Good evening, everyone. So happy to see everyone here. I am Adrian Walker. I'm an LD here at Oakland City Church. And we have a wonderful panel of guests, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a second. But the topic that we're going to kind of discuss today, we'll take open questions from the audience, and we'll just really explore this a little bit deeper here on this Black History Month and the celebration that we do here at Oakland City Church. This particular topic that we're going to talk about in this panel is really, how is American history and critical race theory related? Many people have probably heard the terms, or they've heard the conversations, and or people going back and forth with each other in very passionate ways. But we wanted to explore it here as a community, here as an Oakland community, and here also as a church community, even though the range of this topic is really general and for everybody just to sit in and participate in, whether you're a follower of Christ or not a follower of Christ, doesn't matter. So here, with that, I will let our illustrious panel members introduce themselves. Thank you again, Wesley, LK, and Dr. Connie Davidson for joining. And please, Wesley, why don't you kick off and start a brief intro on yourself, and then LK, and then Connie will move to you, and we'll jump into it.
Can I do one thing before we do that? And it's not to introduce myself, but one of the things that Susan did ask is that we relate everything to the scriptures. So I just want to read the opening scripture for why we're doing what we're doing. And this is coming from Proverbs 4:5-9. Get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget my words or turn away from them. Do not forsake wisdom, and we will protect you, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. Cherish her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will give you a garland to grace your head and present you with a glorious crown. And with that, Wesley, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davidson, for opening us up. I'm Wesley Jacques. Wes is fine. Been privileged to be a part of the Oakland City Church community for a number of years now. I've also been an educator most of my career here in Oakland. I've been a teacher, middle school and elementary school principal, an administrator, among a few other roles for a little over 20 years now. And just really a privilege to be a part of this panel this evening with Dr. Davidson and Dr. Monroe and Elder Adrian, and look forward to discussing this topic with all of you. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm LK Monroe, Alameda County Superintendent of Schools. And like Wes, I have been also a teacher, a principal, and administrator for many years, and then ran for election, became Alameda County Superintendent of Schools in 2014. So have been at the county office ever since. And one of the things that the county office does is run the programs for incarcerated youth, alternative education programs that serve youth throughout the county who, for one reason or another, cannot be served in their districts. So among over 200 other programs, including teacher professional development, et cetera. So it's my privilege to be able to participate on this panel today. Thank you all.
And finally, I'm Dr. Connie Davidson. You can call me Dr. Connie. You can call me Connie. I am recently retired as of December of last year. So I don't want to be too formal. And yes, it's well-deserved. I'm a former middle and high school teacher. I went into teaching at 40. I left corporate America and became a teacher. So I started in middle and high school in San Leandro, and I was a history teacher for 15 years. From there, I went to the County Office of Education on special assignment and coordinated the pre-intern and intern programs for about 2.5 years. Went back to San Leandro High School, was an assistant principal for a term, and realized I did not like administration. So I left and decided to go get my doctorate, and I got that in teacher professional development. I went on to be a faculty member in the pre-service or teacher training programs at Cal State University, Monterey, Fresno, and Los Angeles. And I did that for 15 years, and that's what I retired from. I have my own consulting company called Education Learning Communities. I worked for 20 years for a textbook company, and I was a national trainer. So one of my advantages is I know what people all over the country, how they are different. And I am very pleased to be here. And I just want you to know, I love my sister very, very much, because once I started doing the research on this, it was like being in a cesspool. And I had to really love her to go ahead and say, yes, I will continue to do this. So I'm going to kick this off, because one of the things that Susan asked me to address is, what is critical race theory and why does it matter? So I really think it's important for people to get the historical background on exactly what this is. So I'm going to take my screen. I'm going to take the screen real quick. Share. And presentation. So the first slide is a slide of a gentleman, Dr. Derek Bell. He was the first Black faculty member at Harvard University, and he was actually an attorney, a lawyer, and he did a lot of work with the NAACP. But what he did is he looked at what how the injustice in the legal system, because he's a constitutional lawyer, and he looked at the injustices in the legal system, and from that he was able to talk about how the law embeds these injustices, and he would look at them through the lens of the Constitution. He wrote several books. You can find a lot of the information on this gentleman. If you just go to Google Scholar, you don't want to purchase anything, just go to Google Scholar and read the multiple excerpts that they have there, and you will get a full picture of this gentleman. He's usually embedded in teacher preparation programs because of the fact that when he looked at how pervasive and embedded racial issues, well, we just call it racism now, but how the Constitution was not there to benefit everybody. The Bill of Rights is not for everybody. The Constitution is an economic document, and it's about capitalism. That's what the Constitution is about. It's about the ease of moving money between these 13 colonies. So all the other stuff was their declaration to get rid of England. But embedded in that was the fact that there was always going to be this subclass of non-humans or chattel, and they were called slaves. And slaves built America. That's part of the history that one needs to know, and that the Constitution was very clear that slaves, Africans that were brought here, had no rights whatsoever. And even if you weren't a slave, you still didn't have rights. And if you were Native American, you were a foreigner in your own country. So he wrote many books. And one of the things he always connected to in his literature is that the decisions to do something about and address the injustice of race in America is connected to how it will benefit the powers that be, or the white powers that be, so that they will either look good to the world or make a whole lot of money. Because remember, we're talking about capitalism. But he's the person that first coined the critical race theory. From him, we get the mother of critical race theory, and she is an educator, and this is Gloria Lansin Billings. She is wonderful. You should get Dream Keepers. It will change your life. It's what her quintessential book. She's got many, many books, and you can also see many of her lectures on YouTube, and I encourage you to listen to her, because she took what Derek Bell was talking about and said, if kids in the classroom cannot see themselves, they're not going to learn, because you have to relate to them. And to show how the system that we have in America in education does not relate to your Black and brown children is, we always go, Brown versus the Board of Education was great because it segregated schools. But what it actually did in reality is close the Black schools, because no white kids went to the Black schools. And then when the Black kids went to the white schools, the teachers didn't want them there. And so now you have kids in a hostile environment. And why did they go ahead and do Brown versus the Board of Education and say, okay, segregation is bad? It's because the worldview of America was looking at us and we needed to look good. Now, you can measure this in a lot of different ways. This is my take on it from my research. So now we have Black history in the classrooms. We've got teachers that still don't like kids that are color in the classroom. We've got a lot of inequities going on. And then we are so fortunate to have had, I can never call him president, I just call him Humpty Dumpty. He became the leader of the United States of America for one term. During that term, I'm not going to get into the politics of him at that point, but what I will say is the Black Lives Matter movement, again, spotlighted America internationally. In that spotlight, America was starting to turn a corner, or at least to look like it was, because once again, it was on the international stage. But the movement was making a lot of conservative Republicans very unhappy. So there is a gentleman named Christopher Ruffo. I didn't know this. This guy writes for some Portland journals. He calls himself a journalist, and he writes for some newspapers, and he writes op-eds. But he also is a member of the American Foundation, which is a very conservative right-wing organization. Put America first. He said, we got to do something to stop this movement in its tracks. So he went on Hannity. And on Hannity, he said what I just said to you. He said, critical race theory is a bad thing, and we got to do something about this. Well, of course, Humpty Dumpty listens to Hannity every day. And so when he heard Hannity, he got in touch with Ruffo, and Ruffo wrote the language for the executive order that was signed by Humpty Dumpty on September 20th, 2020. September 20, 2020 is the executive order that says no federal money for any issues that have to do with training in the classroom or making people uncomfortable. And I'm not going to get into a lot of that language because you can find it online, but that language went into the executive order. The purpose of that language was to be as divisive as possible. The purpose of this was to make sure that any proposals regarding race or gender or social identity in any way was to be attacked. And the purpose was to make what kids were, the books or so on that kids were using in the classroom, to become very transparent. That part I don't mind. I think parents need to know what's being taught in classrooms. However, it prohibited teachers from bringing in their own voice about something, or now, depending on the legislation, even talking about current events, if it will make your child uncomfortable or you just don't think it's there. And as a result, very recently, The Bluest Eyes was banned in Kentucky because Maya Angelou wrote it and somebody didn't like what was said in there. The book Mouse has been banned because somebody didn't like to have a little naked mouse in a concentration camp and they didn't like 5 or 6 words that were in the book. So what he intentionally did was bring discourse. He tried to figure out the best way to do it, which is to capture critical race theory, which was already branded as a positive movement, and he turned it around. And I will read you his Twitter quote, and it says, we have successfully framed the band, critical race theory, into a public conversation and are driving up negative perceptions, it will eventually become toxic as we put all of the various critical insanities into that brand. So what you're seeing here is not, yes, it is an attack on Black people, people of color, and what we have done in this country. Absolutely. But it's an attack of convenience. What it actually is a political movement to move nonpartisan school boards, to move nonpartisan political organizations that are doing good in the community, or at least trying, and usurping them, putting in other people in order to change the narrative. That's really important for you to understand this. This is not about history per se. This is about the midterm election and 2024. This can sound like a conspiracy theory, but it is not. And it's very important that you know this. This attack is attack of insanities and rebranding so that he can cause fear, and this fear will move people. So I'm going to stop there, but I wanted you to understand you can't, it's not possible to understand the insanity around this unless you really understand the motive around this of who benefits. So that's where I will leave that. If you have questions, you can ask questions or we can move forward. I hope I explained it well enough so that you understand what's really happening in this debate around critical race theory.
Thanks, Dr. Davidson. Really appreciate that and setting the tone. So to kind of understand and wrap some of what you were saying there. So the starting point of the summary is the critical race theory was coined quite a long time ago, like well over 40 years ago. Yet its resurgence into the national stage of conversation started with the last president, Donald Trump, and right around the time of the elections, as the current president, Joe Biden, came in, ramped up in its number of articles, conversation points, media speaking points. So it had been around for decades, dormant, and then it started to ramp up. And what you're pointing to, and what you're saying, Dr. Davidson, is, this is political motivation around something that is, it's being rebranded in a narrative that has nothing traced to its root. But let's talk about again what it actually is, what it was originally intended to be, and get into those other things. So with that, Dr. Monroe, Wes, do you have, would you want to chime in on that as far as summarizing, what you understand it to be? And also, I think it would be wonderful for guests to understand, when I was starting to research this a little bit more, can you also speak to if you are aware of if it actually is in existence anywhere being taught today in the United States of America? I'll leave it to you, either one of you, to chime in on those things.
Well, Wes, I'll go first. I know you're a little slow off mute there. So thank you so much, Dr. Davidson, for framing the issue, not only giving a broad definition of critical race theory, but framing the issue, and you too as well, Adrian, because this is something that is more than 4 decades old. And we have seen in the current, I mean in the last probably decade and a half, the political construct of our country be now formed around divisiveness and vitriol in such a way that academic concepts become weaponized, if you will, become political footballs. So something that I frequently think about and talk about in terms of this current backlash against critical race theory is Common Core standards. So about a decade ago, Common Core standards were introduced, maybe a little less than that. And really, nationally, we were really excited to finally, as a country, like a lot of countries have a common set of standards that students would be held accountable for. It makes, in order, that's a whole nother conversation, whether you think that, standardized testing should exist, or whether you think that standards are what they should be. However, it was something that was widely accepted. Then this shift began, and there began to be infused in the narrative, well, who made these, and who says, and do we really like these? And particularly from conservative pundits, there was a lot of backlash. And you saw at its height, if I'm not mistaken, I think it got as high as 47 states had adopted the Common Core standards. And then you saw one by one states unadopting those standards, and mostly the states that you would expect. And so that for me was the first time. And I do remember, speaking to groups at that time saying, this is not a political ideology. These are academic standards. These are standards that academicians agree are a set of standards that should guide what students need to know and be able to do in order to be successful. So that was one place, or one of the first places where you saw that infused so deeply and volatilely into the educational system, this rhetoric, and it hasn't slowed from there. So critical race theory, something that and I may drop into the chat if you don't mind, there's an article in EdWeek about critical race theory that I think just kind of gives a good overview of what it is and what it means to schools. That I'll do that in just a moment. But what's important, is like a lot of other movements that we're seeing right now, it calls out the fact that racism is not just an individual belief system. It is an individual belief system, but that individual belief system has caused there to be constructs and frameworks in our society. You hear the term institutional racism, and that disadvantage people of color. So it calls out the fact that, it's more than just a group of people saying they don't like another group of people. It is all the systems and all the economic advantages or disadvantages that have intentionally been put in place in this country to perpetuate what we see in our schools often, which is often that there are schools that are advantaged, schools that are disadvantaged. I'm oversimplifying, but that's what you'll see. And what makes people uncomfortable is in very real ways, like Black Lives Matter, a lot of other movements calling out the fact that this is not by accident. This isn't by accident. People are not making this up, that if you can very clearly trace the decisions that were made and the policies that were put in place to where we are now in many, many ways. So I think at its heart, that is why critical race theory, and I think, Dr. Connie, you said this really well, why those who oppose it are opposing it so vehemently, because it really pulls back the curtain, just like the 1619 Project, many other, both academic and I guess what would be called entertainment now, documentaries, other sources that are now saying what we have always known, but really adding data and narrative and facts to this construct. So I'll stop there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Wes.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, appreciate the framing by Dr. Connie and LK as well. Just want to agree with a couple of points and just build on both my experiences as a educator, but also I think what I've been observing over the last few years. And first and foremost, just I think the point that LK made about the tenets of critical race theory, which again came from Dr. Bell decades ago, really focusing on the legal system, is that racism is not simply about individual bias, that it's deeply rooted in all of our systems, right? Of course, the legal system, but many others, including our education system. One of the things that I've observed, and I think throughout our history, we've really never truly had a reckoning, a racial reckoning, with the history of race, with the construct of race, with slavery, with the treatment of African Americans and other people of color in our country. And I think in the last few years, I think what I've seen happening since, of course, the horrific murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the movement for Black Lives, is that there's been maybe a beginning of some sort of a larger racial conversation and a reckoning. And I really do see this backlash against what's being kind of rebranded as critical race theory as really being political in nature, and really being a political move to stoke racial fears in people, more so than it is about anything that's actually changed in our schools in recent years. I had never, of course, I'd read Dr. Bell's work as a graduate student almost 20 years ago, but we weren't using the term critical race theory in education. I actually only heard it coming back as this kind of rebranding. We would talk about culturally responsive pedagogy from Gloria, Lansin, Billings, as Dr. Connie spoke about. But I really do think some of this is, or I would say most of it is actually more of a response to things we're seeing in our largest society. So just a couple of the things that, of course, if you, as a student or just as a citizen, I think it's really hard to make meaning of anything in current American society if you haven't examined our really deeply and troubling history with race. And so just noticing even in the mainstream in the last couple of years, and almost feeling that there was some progress in terms of, you never heard, for example, and I'm speaking this as a white man and as a white educator, living and working in communities of color. And have learned a lot from African American brothers and sisters, but I'd never heard of Juneteenth in mainstream media until after George Floyd. I knew of the Tulsa massacre, of course, but had never heard of it spoken about in the news or any mainstream setting. Had never heard a president speak about it. And of course, we saw Biden at the 100-year anniversary, speak about in honor of the victims of that massacre. And I think these examples. Of course, that one example of Tulsa and Black Wall Street and the Greenwood Massacre, I think really just sheds just a little bit of light into really the state-sanctioned terrorism, racist terrorism that existed in our country for so long. And if you don't understand those pieces of our history, how do you make sense of George Floyd or anything happening currently? So I do see, some of these conversations that have been happening in the mainstream as really set up for this kind of political backlash. And I guess my hopeful side is that this is all part of this racial reckoning that we really need to have as a country, and is moving us in that direction. With that said, I do think that these laws that have been passed in dozens of states can be very dangerous. Just a couple quick points about, Dr. Monroe spoke about the Common Core standards, which have brought some more alignment in terms of expectations across states in terms of what students learn. But for those of you educators, you're familiar with this, but if you're not, you may not understand that education is a highly decentralized field. 50 states have 50 departments of education. We set our own standards. History is actually more decentralized than math and language arts, which are most states are under Common Core, although not all. So each state actually sets what students are supposed to learn. The California standards for history, which define what students should know, were actually adopted in 2000. I went on to look at a couple of these states that have passed laws to see were there any recent changes in the standards. And I see in Texas and Virginia and other states, 2000, 2010. But when I watch the media, it's almost, some of the reports in the media, you might think that there was some sort of decree passed down and said, now everybody we're teaching critical race theory, and this was a backlash. So really my first interaction with this was really being surprised and trying to understand what exactly are we speaking about, here. And of course, there's a lot more that I can say about that, and be happy to, speak to just my experiences as an educator and how I think race should be dealt with, in schools, for all children, for all American children, for children of color, for African American children, and for white children. Because I think some of the discourse, when you listen to it and you really think about who is the we that we're talking about protecting, it's clear that it's not all children that people are worried about protecting from so-called critical race theory. But last point I'll make, and then just pause for further discussion. But I think I think the dominant narrative of history in this country has been one that has obviously been a distortion. It's been a feel-good history to promote myths about our country, right? Because we have not truly wanted to deal with what the history of our country has been. And I think one of the interesting, I was researching and looked up one of the laws that was recently passed in Texas, and I believe it's now 37 states in that Ed Week article that are cited now having passed some sort of legislation of this type. But the law in Texas, this is an excerpt from it, says slavery and it prohibits teachers from teaching that slavery and racism are anything other than deviations, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. And I thought that was interesting to read because it's actually very transparent in terms of trying to protect a sense of the nation's history, which is really not what we want history to be about. And history should really be about teaching critical thinking, understanding the world from different perspectives, and understanding how we want to be citizens and community members and live in this world, not simply to promote, kind of a blind ideology about a perfect nation. Right. So I just wanted to share that framing. I agree that this is largely political in nature, more to do than any shifts that have actually happened in our schools in recent years.
Yeah, no, I appreciate every comment on that. And to that point, I'll cite an interesting little factoid and data set around that again, is to frame it. And then we'll go to the next set of questions and then start to take questions from the audience. Please feel free, everyone, to write in any questions you may have as we go along, and we'll get those there. But I saw an article that was interesting because, to your point, it's been around forever. Why is it all of a sudden a mainstream talking point? And Wes, you just pointed it out. Has there been some recent change of why there's this fervency around it? And the answer is no. There's been no major changes in any core curriculum for over a decade in most of these states. And so it's again, so you would say, well, then, okay, what's the next data point? Then how does it get to a mainstream conversation in America? That's very hard to do, to get a conversation point across all talking streams of mainstream media. It's not easy to do. You have to have usually many resources to get a topic that high on a degree across the plane. And when I researched where the money was coming from to promote the topic of anti-critical race theory, you see a handful of think tanks that are backed by very wealthy individuals, billionaires, as well as billionaire think tank funded operations. And there's, again, 4 to 5 that seem to be leading the charge in a very concise and concerted and strategic effort that started some years back. We see this a lot, and I'll just call out a simple fact that one of them, called ALEC for short, or American Legislative Exchange Council, helped to fund and wrote over half of the anti-critical race theory narrative and talking points back in 2012 and 13. And then it kind of expanded out from there into Dr. Davidson's point, under the last set of leadership on the presidential side, heard some things pop up on some news stations by this man Ruffo, and then it really kind of sets the stage to take it to the next level. So with that said, and again, it's not really a historical conversation. It's really clear that there's a group that does not want to tell the transparency of history in the country, especially as it relates to slavery and the African Americans that are here, and the systems of oppression that affect all people, especially people of color. And I want to go into the next set of things because I want the audience to also understand, okay, you have a political push that's not really education related, history related, but then there's a business side of this. And I would love, Dr. Davidson, we had a little sidebar before, and I would love for you to talk, because you do work with curriculum on a national scale. You had mentioned about the business of these things and how they play into what core curriculum does and does not do moving forward, and the pressure of educators who want to author books, what they then start to remove out of their books if they want it distributed across 50 states. Hey, if I'm an author and an educator and I make my living doing this, of course I want my book to sell and I want it in schools. But if you're telling me that I can't talk about certain facts of history, then it's a financial pressure on an industry that will say, is it known to make the most money out of all the industries in the world? And so what is that financial pressure that you think authors and educators start to feel, and how that will start to snowball, and how this essentially this ploy or this political push can be very successful by just creating financial pressure on the industry in and of itself? Dr. Davidson, if you want to just talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
I mentioned that for 20 years, I worked with a textbook company, and they're an extremely responsible textbook company. It's a boutique company. You have the very large ones, which are Pearson, and I can't even remember the other ones now because I'm retired and I don't have to remember what they are. But this is a very small company, and it was a startup, and I happened to be a brand new teacher when they started up. So I was there at the beginning working with them. So now a year ago, they asked me to look at their new textbook because they're getting ready to go into the new cycles for adoption. And so for those of you who don't know how this works, it's about every 10 years, textbook companies have to introduce a new textbook, modernize it, bring it up to date, especially for history, because there's nothing worse than having a 20-year-old history book. So the states will say, we want this stuff in these history books. And so there are only a few states that drive all of the history books. I can't speak to English or science. I can only speak to history. And California, New York, Texas, and I think Florida now are the 4 states that drive what's going to be in the book, because they're the biggest purchasers. So if you're in Idaho, you just get whatever Texas said they wanted. So the point is that now they wanted me to read their books so I could give them feedback. And so as I was reading through, they're talking about slaves and they kept calling them African Americans. And I said, these are not African Americans. They don't get to be African Americans until the 13th Amendment. That's after the Civil War. These are slaves. So then we had to figure out, well, what can we call them? And enslaved people, people in bondage. I said, well, I'm going to call them slaves, and here's some other terms you can use, because the problem is this. They are really a responsible company. And they've made some mistakes in the past that I've called them on, but overall, they're very responsible. And they want to get the history out correctly. But when you have a state like Texas, it says you can't use the word slave in a book that talks about slaves. You have to find another term. You can't use the word master, because they don't want kids to get the impression that slaves had masters. Then there's this whole juggling act that's going on right now in the business of education. And we're talking about billions of dollars when you talk about a whole country. And some of the textbook companies don't care, because I've read their textbooks, but other textbook companies want to be responsible. So here we are, we're playing with, well, what are the words that you can use? How are you going to present this so that it's real and authentic, and you are teaching what actually happened in America, but you still want to make that sell in Florida. You still want to sell it in Idaho. You still need to have Illinois buy it. So there's this whole critical race theory piece with these 37 states jumping on board. Remember, this is political. It's history. Yeah, like I'm saying, Black folks are an easy target. So this was an easy sell. because you don't want to feel bad. And I just want to say this before I let the other panelists have the floor. It's that it is very difficult to reconcile when you are a Christian. It is difficult to reconcile that in those 37 states, a lot of those people that have signed up are evangelical Christians. And they're going for the okie doke on this. And why are they doing this? Is because they're being persuaded and they don't even know that they're being manipulated. And because it's a climate of fear. And if you can keep people in fear, you can manipulate them. And so if the truth comes out, then people actually won't be in fear. They might have something to think about, but you can't get them to just go along with your program. So Black history is important, but we have to stop teaching Black history, and we need to teach through Black history. And those narratives are the narratives that they want to keep out of the classroom.
Exactly. So on that point, I do want to touch something for all the panelists to talk to really quickly. And I see a couple questions popping in. I want to read a verse. I want to talk specifically to followers of Christ, or those who consider themselves in the Christian community, and how they see themselves in the conversation or participating to stand in solidarity in this conversation as we see it, right? And so I want to read something from Isaiah 5, chapter 5, verse 20. And Isaiah, a prophet, says this: "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And there are multiple verses in the Bible that say similar things to this, about calling good bad, bad good, and that it's a twisted sense of essentially Satan and the enemy, and what is the antithesis of what Christ is teaching us, right? So with that being said, that we have this scripture that talks about this, and now you say, well, that's a little meta. These sometimes Bible verses, like, where does it hit us today? Where is it realistic today? How is that a talking point today? And what we're seeing is a real life example in some ways. We're living it in real time. We're living the history where you're saying to yourself, this isn't about what is being, it's clear that there's a narrative being developed here to call something what it is not. Now, as Christians, how do we take that and how do we look at what's going on around us? And Dr. Monroe and Wes, again, if you can just chime in and say, speaking to not just the people on, we'll say, not preaching to the choir, but those in the Christian community that seem to be very opposing to this conversation of how we teach history, how we call things what they are. What would be a message or a takeaway point that you want to say, hey, if we're all in this together, if we're all followers of Christ, there should be some things that are just the baseline. And if you have any of those points, would love to hear them. And then I'm going to get directly to Jent's questions. So thank you, Gent, for your questions before we wrap up here in the next 10 minutes. So please kind of keep it concise. But if you have any points there, it'd be great.
If I could just, this brings up a lot for me, and I'm sure it does for a lot of people, a lot of us as believers in this time, as I started out talking about where we are just politically, where the narrative is as a country, how we are pitted against one another in ways that we weren't before, or at least that weren't being talked about before. I was just talking to a friend the other day who lives in Georgia, and she was talking about her struggle because she lives, we know what the political climate is like for the most part in Georgia. And she used to be part of a women's Bible study that recently sent out an email that said, don't want to miss this. We're going to be talking about, they took out the word race. We're going to be talking about critical theory at our next Bible study. And so for her, she had long stopped attending because this was a trend, but this is something that is becoming in some places so much a part of the theology and worship practices for some communities, Christian communities, that it gets difficult for people to separate. The other thing that I'll say, and this again could be its own talk, is social media perpetuating our own, basically being an echo chamber for the things that we're hearing and the things that our group is saying. Something that I want to share that I hope speaks to this, because I just wanted to get it in before we ended, is there are, and Wes, you may know about this, I'm going to show this book. So the Kinsey collection is a collection, he boasts the largest collection of African-American art and artifacts in the country, travels all around the country. But one of the things that I think is important to think about is what he talks about, which is this theory that is called the myth of absence. So what has happened in our school and society by the absence of the narrative of history being told as it should be told, people being left out, incidents being left out. I mean, Wes mentioned Greenwood. There's also Rosewood in Florida. And our ancestors really, their way of dealing with that was to stay silent. It was years before people knew. It was too painful to talk about, and there wasn't an outlet for it. So he talks about things like the first Black Tour de France winner, and the fact that a lot of our kids think things like, oh, Black people don't ride bikes or aren't cyclists, that I can't become a swimmer. There are stories that purposely, just like those that are being raised to the fore right now, that have been purposely suppressed throughout history. So much so that when we're rewriting those histories, those stories have been lost for the most part. So this has been his life's work, and it's something that I've been working on with him for years to figure out how to bring to the schools, and with the help of the Oakland Museum. But this myth of absence, like, you weren't actually there. Your people never did this. You didn't contribute to that. Very intentional removal of certain populations, Blacks, African Americans, and American Indians, indigenous peoples, to name just a few. So this, when we're talking about, critical race theory, and I liked Wes reminding us that we have talked for years about culturally relevant pedagogy and what that means, and what it means to actually not just make kids from different backgrounds feel comfortable in your classroom, but to actually understand and be grounded in the history of their communities. And for some, as an educator, you'll be the only conduit to that they have. That story or narrative may have been lost in their own homes and their own communities. So it's essentially important. So I will stop there.
Wes, anything to add on that point about the Christian community and how this should be taken as that form? And I have a quick follow-up, and we have 5 minutes. So I do want to get to Jen's follow-up. So any point you would want to make there, Wes?
Yeah, there's a lot I could say. I'll probably be as brief as possible, since I know you want to get to other questions as well. But no, I really struggle with this as well. And I think sometimes I think sometimes we can fall into traps of when we think about false idols and worshiping nationalism or patriotism as if that's the religion, and we're are we followers of Christ? Who I think I see throughout the Bible examples of pushing us through kind of our tribal instincts, and pushing us to care for them and tell the stories of the least among us. And so I think that most Christians would profess, even people that would be scared of critical race theory, would probably profess that they would like to see all people as their brothers and sisters, even if they are fearful of this. And so I just wonder how we can have positive framing, that we need to tell the stories of all people. and as educators, and that we're not truly a full Christian community if we're not telling the stories of all of our Christian brothers and sisters and non-Christian brothers and sisters. And so I think as educators, we always ask that question: whose story is being told here, right?
Yes.
And whose story is not? And what are the implications of telling the story in this way? And history in schools is not simply about espousing a theory and teaching the children to the theory. Children are not empty receptacles that we drop knowledge into. They're critical thinkers that we expect to wrestle with different perspectives and opinions, and that needs to be the truth will set us free. It needs to be the fullest version of the truth that we can provide to our students.
For
so
sure.
I would say going from the positive and our values and what we believe in is something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, and I'll just go ahead, Dr. Davidson. Yeah.
I just want to add to what both LK and Wesley said, this a dimension that has not been brought up here, but is really important to understand. First of all, teaching is really, really hard when you do it right. It's really hard. It's time. It's all consuming. You never stop thinking about teaching when you really are passionate about the teaching. A lot of teachers who were actually passionate, doing a great job, have retired. The pandemic threw a lot of them out. They just said, I'm not going back. I can't do this anymore. And now we're being filled with brand new teachers. A brand new teacher is just trying to survive. And you've got schools that have teachers that are less than 2 years in teaching, and you have administrators that are maybe 1 or 2 years in leadership. And those are the people that are on the campus with kids of color. And the teachers are saying, just give me a curriculum that I can hold on to so I can get through these few years until I figure out how to be a teacher. And you have an administrator that has the district and the county and the state on top of them saying, make sure things are done this way. And you have parents on the other side that are saying, make sure things are done for my child. And the problem is that if you give a curriculum to a teacher that's incomplete and the teacher is new and doesn't know it's incomplete, they'll still teach it because it's expedient. And because a new teacher is drowning. I did my research on new teachers. Those first 3 to 5 years is a killer. Most of them leave the profession because it's so hard. And so textbooks throw out this curriculum. They say, teach this to any kid. It's called research-based curriculum. Teach this to any kid with veracity and they're going to learn. Well, I have a lot of issues with that because, and it's a little story. I walk into a classroom, observe a teacher in English, third graders at the communities. I hate it, 66 and Havens Court. I can't remember the name of the school right now, but there's a school on 66 and Havens Court. It used to be Havens Court Junior High School, but now it's a elementary and a lot of other schools in there. And I go to see the teacher, and the teacher's teaching 3rd or 4th grade. It's open court, and the teacher is showing them a schooner. And the story is about a schooner. Now, almost every child in this classroom is a second language learner or Black. And they're looking at a schooner. I know what a schooner is. And they're supposed to read this story about a schooner. This doesn't relate to these kids, but it's supposed to be research-based. And if you do it, it'll work. So this is an instrument. We have to understand the textbook is an instrument. Teachers that are passionate go above and beyond whatever the textbook says. But a new teacher is just trying to survive. And so you have that dichotomy, which means that they will put in this information that's negative to start out with because they just want to get through the day. And the school said it was okay because this is a curriculum. And that's the catch-22 in all of this. The teachers get manipulated as well, even though they may know what they're doing is not appropriate for the kids. And so it's a real dilemma. I've had a lot of conversations with new teachers about that. Is how do I do this? How do I get them to engage? Because they don't see themselves, they're not going to engage.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Davis, for that. I do want to wrap up with 2 quick questions from the audience. And again, kind of bring it back through the lens of followers of Christ in the Christian community. And we have a question here from Jen. He says, I've heard folks who dislike critical race theory claim that it forces people into categories of oppressor and oppressed, and therefore teaches that all white people are the oppressor. Is this a mischaracterization, or is there some truth in this? And that's his questions. I would love to hear your comments, and I want to say something on that really quickly before releasing to the rest of the panel. I had an interesting conversation with a lot of people who are first generation immigrants in this country, who noticed the first thing they noticed when coming to this country is the anti-intellectualism that is throughout our culture, as they put it. Meaning there seems to be a purposeful dumbing down of the population. That's coming from a group of people that had the highest expectations for what America was, came in here and saw something different. And I'll also point this out from a scriptural standpoint. When we're looking at Egypt and the Hebrews, right, who were enslaved for hundreds of years, right? If you go into the Egyptian hieroglyphs today, this is an apples to apples analogy to me. They don't talk about the Hebrews the way the Hebrews talk about the Hebrews, right? So I would love, the context as followers of Christ, to his question, which is, does it categorize people as oppressed and oppressor? Is this a mischaracterization, and how do you all see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say to that briefly is, I think that would be an oversimplification, but I do think there, of course, is an element. We can't talk about racism and its impacts without talking about who is privileged by systems of racism. And so we can't understand current day inequities. Our children, anyone in our society, really, to be an informed citizen, can't understand current day inequities, whether that's in wealth, education, health, if we don't understand the ways in which white people have benefited. I do think, though, to some of the original points made by my colleagues, that it is not simply about interpersonal bias. It's not an individual to blame, although we as white people may benefit from it. It's systemic, and it really plays out in different forms. And so I think that I would see that as an oversimplification of critical race theory. Although, again, just making the point that there has not been an official, we're teaching critical race theory in schools, and so just would also want to take us back to that point as well.
Dr. Monroe, anything to add to that?
I really think that as followers of Christ, we absolutely have an opportunity in this moment. I mean, there is a political inflection point around race, but I believe that there's also a spiritual one, because our faith, our belief, is being used for political purposes in a lot of ways. And really, as a follower of Christ, I don't believe that you can truly understand what underlies either these economic constructs, these racial constructs, these human dynamics, unless you see it through the lens of the love of Christ. And that's what's missing for a lot of people. They take the judgment part, and also, Scripture calls us in numerous ways to look at our own heart. And I feel it's clear that that's missing for a lot of people. So when you ask, is there an oppressor and are there oppressed? Yes, there are, in many, many circumstances, in many, many ways. And you have to take responsibility for that. I am a person who identifies African-American, but I understand my privilege too, as an educated woman. So I have to take responsibility when I walk into a room with another Black woman who may not have that same either my position or my education. And as a follower of Christ, it is my responsibility to make sure that others who are around me are uplifted, and that I'm looking at folks through the eyes of Christ, and even those whom I would prefer not to look at, if I had the choice. That we are entrusted to be the bearers of the good news, and we also don't have the option to look away and throw up our hands. We have to figure out where we're being called to make a difference and to speak into any given situation.
Thank you so much for that. And one last question here before we wrap up. This question says, prior to the movement against CRT in primary secondary education, I had hoped that a more inclusive history curricula could lead to a more empathetic, dialogue-based and critical thought amongst children, and ultimately systems changed by more informed citizens. Now, in such a divisive time, what can individuals and churches do to support comprehensive history in schools? Any last thoughts on that and last key takeaways as we wrap up here? I'll start with you, Wes, go to Dr. Monroe, and end with Dr. Davidson.
Yeah, I do want to just speak to that question. I mean, I do think there is, in spite of the context of this conversation, the political nature of this movement, I think there has been some progress and there has been some opening in recent history. California is one of many states that have moved towards having ethnic studies courses, which of course that's another discussion of why ethnic studies needs to be separate from history, because the history of marginalized people has not historically been centered. But there has been some progress, and even here in Oakland. We just recently adopted a 4th and 5th grade curriculum that is completely digital, gets updated every year, and really working hard to make sure that Indigenous communities, Black communities, LGBT communities, that really marginalized communities are centered. And so I do think there are efforts and movements, and just even with the progress with the 1619 project, and that being out there. And just final point I would want to make, even though that is officially not curriculum anywhere, I know it is utilized. I think what we really want for our students is not simply just to change the history, but to have students weighing multiple perspectives. And so students should be reading critiques of critical race theory, right along with reading critical race theory, right along with reading sources from the 1619 Project, which centers the beginning of slavery and the African-American experience at the center of history, not at the margins. So that's really what we want for our students to become full critical thinkers, is to expose them to all of this, not to indoctrinate from any perspective.
Thank you.
Everything you said. I think talking about what the church can do, this is what the church can do. What we're doing now today is having these discussions that often people feel are not appropriate in church in some settings. So I think that it is important for us to continue to have the discussions. I understand people grow fatigued sometimes of that, and we need to be able to say that too, that it needs to be a safe place, particularly for people from communities of color, that, that they don't necessarily always want to be the emissary for this issue that they traverse each and every day. And then I'll also say, because Wes mentioned the curriculum on Chromebooks, which, to Dr. Davidson's point, is a really important move. It also, the flip side of that, however, is with Common Core and other things, we were getting to this point where we're really helping teachers learn about how to guide students to engage in discourse. And we need to make sure that that doesn't get lost. And we're seeing that in a lot of classrooms now with virtual learning, that the pendulum has swung to everybody's on their computer, everything's on your computer, it's isolated, and often that discourse isn't happening. So we really need to ensure that we're returning to the focus on that.
Thank you. And Dr. Davidson, to wrap up.
Well, I think being a Christian woman and knowing that my purpose in life is to teach teachers how to teach all kids. That's my purpose. And there's a whole long story about that, but that's why I went into teaching, is because God called me to a particular purpose. And I'm fortunate to have identified it. And I loved every single solitary moment of working with teachers so that they would understand how to really teach the children that they get, not the children that they want. That was an answered prayer. My prayer, it's so hard because there's such negativity that has been infused into church. in order to get people to think a particular way. And schools, which were supposed to be bastions of opportunity for people to learn and reflect and to build and have opportunity, are now being used as places to direct thinking, to marginalize, to make invisible populations in general. So what is it we need to do? We need to pray. We need to pray a lot, but we need to act. Part of the action are conversations like this, and part of the actions are actually going to schools as parents and finding out exactly what's going on in that classroom with this kid, and then having conversations around what you see with those who can make a change. But parents, you have a voice. You are history too. You have value. You have a narrative. You want narratives to be in that classroom? Then you need to volunteer when you can, or record your narrative and let kids hear it so that they understand history is made by people every single day, not just heroes and heroines, but they're made by you and me and every single person here. So I want to close with this proverb because this says it all for me. And this is Proverbs 2:12-15. Wisdom will save you from the ways of wicked men, from men whose words are perverse, who have left the straight path to talk in dark ways, who delight in doing wrong and rejoice in the perverseness of evil, whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. We must always be alert. We must always have our candles trimmed and ready because we never know where those fiery darts are going to come from.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davidson. Thank you, panel, Dr. Monroe, Wesley. So much appreciated. So much appreciate your thoughts, adding to the conversation. And thanks for the closing remarks, Dr. Davidson, there with wisdom, right? If as a church, if you want to protect yourself from false things, you have to pray for wisdom. So that is at the very least what I would highly encourage all of us to do on a daily basis. And